My father-in-law gave me everything in his will, skipping his own kids. Now they're accusing me of taking advantage of a dying man. The accusation started 3 days after Richard's funeral. I was still wearing the black dress I'd bought for Ethan's service 2 years earlier when the attorney called. There's been a development, he said carefully. Kevin and Brittany are contesting the will. I wasn't surprised at the reading. When Richard's children learned their father had left his $2.3 million estate to his dead son's widow instead of them, Brittany's face went white with rage. This is impossible, she hissed. Dad was confused, medicated. She manipulated him. Kevin just stared at me with cold calculation. We'll be in touch, he said as they stormed out. Richard and I had gotten close after Ethan died. My husband was only 34 when a heart attack took him, leaving me a 29-year-old widow drowning in grief and medical bills. While Kevin and Brittany lived their busy lives in other states, I was the one who drove Richard to chemo appointments, organized his medications, and held his hand during the worst nights. You're the daughter I never had, he'd tell me. Kevin only calls when he needs money, and Brittany hasn't visited in 3 years. It was true. During Richard's entire cancer battle, Kevin visited twice, and Brittany sent flowers once. I slept in the hospital chair during his worst episodes, learned to manage his pain pump, and researched experimental treatments when the doctors ran out of options. The manipulation accusations hurt because they weren't entirely baseless. I had influenced Richard's decision, just not how they imagined. It started 6 months before he died when Richard asked about my financial situation. I'd been honest about the medical debt from Ethan's final months, how I was working double shifts as a dental hygienist just to stay afloat. Ethan would want me to take care of you, he said. Let me help. I refused his offers of money, but Richard was persistent, strategic. He started small, paying for groceries, covering my vehicle maintenance, insisting it was what Ethan would have wanted. Each time I protested, he'd get that stubborn look that reminded me so much of my dead husband. Then came the conversation that changed everything. Richard had just finished a brutal round of chemo. We were in his hospital room when he brought up his will. Kevin and Brittany don't need my money, he said quietly. Kevin makes 6 figures in technology. Brittany married that investment fund manager. But you, he trailed off, but I knew what he meant. I was struggling while his biological children lived comfortably, rarely bothering to check on their dying father. I want to change my will. Leave everything to you, he announced. No, I said immediately. That's not right. They're your children. Are they? He asked bitterly. When's the last time either of them called just to talk? When have they ever put my needs before their convenience? I spent 3 weeks trying to talk him out of it, suggesting splitting the estate or leaving me a smaller portion, but Richard was adamant. You've been more family to me in 2 years than they've been in decades, he said. This is my decision. The day he signed the new will, I felt sick with guilt, not because I'd manipulated him, but because part of me was relieved. Ethan's medical bills had destroyed my credit. I was facing bankruptcy. Now, looking at the legal papers Kevin and Brittany had filed, I saw their strategy. They claimed I'd isolated Richard from his family, influenced him while he was on pain medication, and exploited his grief over Ethan's death. The worst part? Some of it sounded plausible even to me. But what they didn't know was that Richard had anticipated this fight. 3 days before he died, barely conscious from the morphine, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. In my desk, he whispered. Bottom drawer, hidden compartment. I thought it was delirium, but after reading their legal filing I knew I had to check. What I found in that hidden compartment would change everything about this inheritance battle. Richard's house felt different without him. Every room held memories. Him dozing in his recliner during chemo treatments, teaching me his mother's cornbread recipe, showing me photo albums from Ethan's childhood I'd never seen. His study remained exactly as he'd left it. The mahogany desk was covered with prescription bottles, legal documents, and the James Patterson novel he'd been reading when he got too weak to focus. I ran my fingers along the bottom drawer, feeling for irregularities. There, a small depression in the wood. When I pressed it, a narrow panel slid away, revealing a hidden compartment barely big enough for an envelope. Inside were 3 items that made my hands shake. A flash drive, a letter addressed to me, and a manila folder labeled evidence. I opened the letter first. Richard's familiar handwriting, though shakier than usual, filled 2 pages. My dear daughter-in-law, if you're reading this, then Kevin and Brittany are likely challenging my will. I anticipated this, which is why I spent the last year documenting everything. The flash drive contains recordings of every conversation I had with my children over the past 18 months. You'll hear exactly how often they called, what they said about my illness, and their true feelings about you and Ethan. The folder contains financial records showing how they've treated me as their personal ATM for years, along with evidence of their real character. I'm not giving you this to hurt them, but to protect what's rightfully yours. You earned this inheritance through love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Don't let them take what Ethan would have wanted you to have. Oh, my love, Richard. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop with trembling fingers. The files were organized by date, each labeled with Richard's meticulous attention to detail. The first recording was from 13 months ago. Kevin calling after Richard's initial cancer diagnosis. Hey Dad. Heard about the C word. That sucks. Listen, I've got this startup opportunity, but I need about 15 grand to get in on the ground floor. Since you're not exactly spending much these days. Richard's voice was steady but sad. Kevin, I just started chemotherapy. I might need that money for medical expenses. Come on, Dad. You've got great insurance. This is a sure thing. I'll pay you back with interest. The next file was Brittany 2 weeks later. Daddy, I'm so sorry about your diagnosis. I wanted to visit, but you know how crazy things are with the kids and David's work schedule. Hey, did Kevin mention his investment thing? Because we could really use some help with Chloe's private school tuition. It's only $8,000 per semester, and you always said education was important. I listened to months of these calls, requests for money disguised as concern, excuses for why they couldn't visit wrapped in false sympathy, and worst of all, their conversations about me. Kevin's voice on a call from 6 months ago made my stomach turn. I still don't understand why you're so attached to Ethan's widow. She's not even family anymore. You should focus on your real children. Brittany was even crueler. She's obviously trying to position herself as your caregiver, so she can get something when you die. It's actually pretty manipulative when you think about it. Richard's response was quietly devastating. She's here every day making sure I take my medications and get to appointments. She held my hand during my worst chemo session, while you were at a wine tasting in Sonoma. Tell me again who's being manipulative. But the recordings revealed more than just their greed and neglect. They painted a picture of 2 adults who had never learned to see their father as anything more than a resource to be exploited. One particularly painful conversation from 8 months ago showed how little they understood about Richard's condition. Brittany had called during one of his worst weeks, when chemotherapy had left him so weak he could barely lift his head. Daddy, I need to talk to you about something important, she'd said, her voice bright and oblivious. David's company is having this charity auction, and I promised we'd donate something significant. Could you write a check for maybe $5,000? It's for the children's hospital, so it's basically a tax write-off anyway. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Brittany, I'm having a really bad day. The chemo. Oh, come on. Can't be that bad. You always were a bit dramatic about being sick. Remember when you had that flu when I was 16? You acted like you were dying then, too. I remembered that day. I'd found Richard crying in his bathroom after the call, not from physical pain, but from the devastating realization that his own daughter saw his cancer battle as an act. Kevin's recording from the same period was even worse. He'd called on a Tuesday evening, right after Richard had received news that the first round of chemotherapy hadn't been as effective as hoped. Dad, quick question. I'm looking at this investment property, but I need to move fast. Could you wire me 30 grand by Friday? I know it sounds like a lot, but the potential return is massive. Kevin, I just got some difficult news from my oncologist. Yeah, I'm sure it's fine. These doctors always give worst-case scenarios to cover themselves legally. Anyway, about that wire transfer. Richard had tried again to explain the severity of his situation, but Kevin cut him off with impatience. Dad, you're going to beat this thing. You're too stubborn to die. But this property won't wait, so can you get that money to me or not? What hurt most was listening to Richard's voice change over the months. In early recordings, he still held hope that his children might step up, that the crisis would bring the family together. By the later files, resignation had crept in. He stopped trying to share details about his treatment, stopped asking about their lives, stopped expecting anything beyond their financial requests. The folder of financial records was equally damning. Richard had kept meticulous documentation going back 7 years, showing a pattern of one-sided financial support that had accelerated dramatically since Ethan's death. Kevin's requests weren't just frequent, they were calculated. He always called right after Richard received insurance payouts or income from his rental properties. The amounts escalated over time, starting with a few hundred for vehicle issues, and eventually reaching the $15,000 startup investment. But it wasn't just the money. Richard had documented every promise to pay him back, every excuse for why the repayment was delayed, every new crisis that required forgiveness of the previous debt. Kevin owed his father over $67,000 and had never repaid a single dollar. Brittany's pattern was different but equally manipulative. She positioned her requests as investments in Richard's grandchildren, knowing he wouldn't refuse anything framed as being for Chloe and Leo's benefit: private school tuition, summer camps, tennis lessons, tutoring. She had convinced her father to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford by claiming it was all for the children's education and development. The records showed she'd received $43,000 over 5 years, always with tearful explanations about wanting to give her children opportunities she'd never had. But Richard had also documented her Instagram posts, showing expensive vacations, designer clothes, and restaurant bills that proved the money wasn't all going to the children. Most damning was a messaging app conversation Richard had captured between Brittany and Kevin from 3 months before his death. They'd been coordinating their requests to avoid asking for money at the same time, treating their dying father like a business to be managed efficiently. Brittany: "Did you ask about the investment thing yet?" Kevin: "Not yet. Waiting for his next doctor appointment. He always feels guilty about being a burden after medical stuff." Brittany: "Smart. I'm going to hit him up for Chloe's summer program next week. Leo needs new hockey equipment too." Kevin: "Think we should space it out more? Don't want him getting suspicious." Brittany: "Please. He's too far gone to notice patterns. Besides, what's he going to do with the money anyway? At least we're putting it to good use." Kevin: "True. Just wish Ethan's widow would stop hovering. She makes him feel like he doesn't need us anymore." Brittany: "I know. It's honestly gross how she's attached herself to him. Like, get a life." Reading those messages felt like a physical blow. While they were strategizing how to extract more money from their dying father, I was learning to cook his favorite foods because chemotherapy had destroyed his appetite. While they saw his generosity as weakness to be exploited, I was driving him to 6 a.m. medical appointments because the steroids made him too wired to sleep. But the evidence went deeper than financial manipulation. Richard had documented instances of emotional manipulation that painted an even darker picture of his children's character. One particularly cruel example was from Brittany during Richard's first surgery. She'd called him the night before, supposedly to offer support, but the conversation had quickly turned manipulative. "Daddy, I'm so scared about tomorrow," she'd said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I keep thinking about what would happen if something went wrong. The kids would be devastated to lose their grandfather." Richard had tried to comfort her, assuring her that the surgery was routine and the doctors were optimistic. I know, Brittany had continued. "It's just that David's been so stressed about money lately, and if something happened to you, I don't know how we'd manage. Not financially, well, maybe financially too, but mostly emotionally. The kids depend on you so much." She'd managed to work in a request for emergency funds while simultaneously making Richard feel guilty for putting his family through the stress of his illness. The recording captured him agreeing to transfer $5,000 for Leo's hockey tournament fees, even though he was scheduled for surgery in 12 hours. Kevin's manipulation was more direct but equally calculating. He'd started calling Richard Pops after the cancer diagnosis, a nickname he'd never used before. The term appeared in phone messages, always followed by requests for money, as if the artificial intimacy would make Richard more likely to say yes. The most disturbing recording was from Kevin just 6 weeks before Richard's death. By this point, Richard was confined to bed most days, his weight had dropped 40 pounds, and he was struggling to maintain coherent conversations due to pain medication. "Hey Pops, how are you feeling today? Kevin had asked with forced cheerfulness. Not great, son. The doctors are talking about transitioning to comfort care. What does that mean exactly? Kevin had asked, and for a moment I thought he was showing genuine concern. It means they can't cure the cancer anymore. We're just trying to keep me comfortable for whatever time I have left. There was a pause. Then Kevin's voice changed to business mode. Well, in that case, we should probably talk about some financial planning. I've been researching tax implications of inheritance, and there might be some strategies we should implement now to minimize what the government takes. Richard's voice was weak but incredulous. Kevin, I just told you I'm dying, and you want to talk about taxes? I'm trying to be practical, Pops. You'd want your money to go to family, not the Treasury Department, right? There are some trust structures we could set up, some gifts we could make now to avoid estate taxes later. I've got a lawyer friend who could help us out. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Kevin pushing various schemes to move Richard's assets before his death. Not once did he ask about his father's pain levels, his fears, or how he could provide emotional support during this transition to end-of-life care. When Richard finally said he was too tired to continue the conversation, Kevin's parting words were, "Just think about it, Pops. Time isn't exactly on our side here." Listening to that recording, I understood why Richard had made his decision about the will. This wasn't about money, it was about dignity. He'd realized that his biological children saw his approaching death primarily as a financial opportunity to be optimized rather than a loss to be grieved. The contrast with my own interactions couldn't have been starker. Richard had also recorded several of our conversations, apparently to document the difference in how he was treated. In one from around the same time as Kevin's tax planning call, I'd been helping Richard organize his medications when he brought up his mortality. "I know this is hard for you," he'd said. "Losing Ethan was enough tragedy for one lifetime. You shouldn't have to watch another person you care about fade away." "It's not about what I should or shouldn't have to do," I'd replied. "It's about what you need. And right now, you need someone who sees you as more than your medical condition or your bank account. You need family." "You really think of me as family?" he'd asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I do. You're Ethan's father. You raised the man I loved. That makes you my family too forever. Money and wills and inheritance don't change that." The recording captured him crying, something I'd thought he'd hidden from me at the time. Later in the same conversation, he'd asked about my financial struggles, and I deflected, not wanting to burden him with my problems. "Ethan always said you were terrible at asking for help," he'd said with gentle humor. "He made me promise to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. Please let me keep that promise." Even then, I tried to minimize my needs, suggesting he save his energy and resources for his treatment. It was Richard who'd insisted on paying for my groceries that week, and the recording captured me protesting every step of the way. "You've given me something more valuable than money," I told him. "You've shared Ethan's childhood stories, his favorite recipes, parts of him I never knew. That's worth more than anything else you could give me." The difference between these conversations and those with his biological children was stark. Where Kevin and Brittany called with demands disguised as needs, I consistently tried to give rather than take. Where they saw opportunity in his vulnerability, I saw a man deserving of dignity and compassion. But the most revealing evidence wasn't in the recordings or financial documents. It was in Richard's private journal entries, which he transcribed and included in the evidence folder. The entries spanned the entire 18 months of his illness, providing insight into his mental state and decision-making process that would prove crucial in the legal battle ahead. The early entries showed a man holding on to hope that his illness might bring his family closer together. "Told the kids about the diagnosis today." Kevin seemed more concerned about how this might affect his visit plans for the winter holidays than about the actual cancer. Brittany cried, but then immediately started talking about how stressed this makes her. Neither asked about treatment options or prognosis. Maybe they're just processing the shock. "First chemo session tomorrow. Ethan's widow offered to drive me and sit with me during the infusion. I told her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. She's been through enough medical trauma for one lifetime." Kevin said he'd try to call during the treatment if his schedule allowed. Chemo was rough, but having someone there helped. She brought magazines, snacks, even a phone charger because she knew the sessions are long. Talked to me about everything except cancer, Ethan's favorite movies, her work at the dental office, books she's reading. Made the time pass quickly. Kevin never called. As the months progressed, the entries revealed Richard's growing awareness of the disparity in how his children treated him. Brittany finally visited for Leo's birthday weekend. Spent more time on her mobile device than talking to me. Asked for money for Leo's orthodontics 3 times in 2 days. Didn't mention the cancer until I brought it up, then changed the subject to her kitchen renovation plans. She seems to see my illness as an inconvenience to her normal life. Kevin called with another investment opportunity. When I mentioned that the latest scan showed some tumor growth, he said, "That sucks," and immediately went back to explaining his business plan. I don't think he even processed what I'd said. How did I raise someone so disconnected from other people's pain? Had a terrible reaction to the new medication cocktail. Ended up in the ER at 3 a.m. Ethan's widow was there in 20 minutes, still in her pajamas. Stayed until I was discharged 8 hours later. Didn't complain once about missing work or being tired. Kevin sent a message the next day asking if I was still in the hospital, or whatever. The entries around the time Richard decided to change his will were particularly poignant. Been thinking a lot about legacy lately. What does it mean to leave something behind? Kevin and Brittany will split my money and probably fight over the house. But will they remember how I liked my coffee? Will they tell their children stories about their grandfather? Will they visit my grave more than once a year? She knows I take my pills at 8 p.m. and always asks if I remembered them. She knows I can't sleep without the humidifier running. She knows I get nauseated if I eat too soon after chemo. These are the things family members know about each other. When did my own children stop paying attention to who I actually am? Made the decision today. Ethan would want his wife taken care of, and she's the only one who's actually taken care of me. Kevin and Brittany will be angry, but they forfeited their claim to my care when they chose to see me as a resource instead of a person. The final entries, written in the weeks before his death, showed a man at peace with his decision. Signed the new will today. She tried to talk me out of it again. Suggested leaving her just enough to pay off Ethan's medical bills. But this isn't about her. It's about them. They need to learn that relationships can't be transactional forever. Maybe losing the inheritance will teach them something about the value of genuine connection. Overheard her on the phone with her friend, talking about how worried she is about me. Not about money or inheritance, about whether I'm in pain, whether I'm scared, whether there's anything else she can do to help. This is what love sounds like. I'd forgotten. Hard day today. Pain is getting worse. She sat with me for 6 hours, reading aloud from my favorite book because the morphine makes it hard to focus on the pages. Kevin called and she answered, explained I was having a rough day. He said, "Tell him I'll try to call back later," and hung up. She didn't tell me he'd called until the next day, and only because I asked if anyone had checked on me. She was protecting me from their indifference, even while I was too medicated to notice. The last entry was dated 3 days before Richard's death. Getting close now. Told her about the hidden compartment today. She'll need the evidence when Kevin and Brittany try to challenge the will. They will, of course, not because they loved me, but because they counted on my money being there for them. I hope someday they'll understand that I didn't cut them out to be cruel. I cut them out because they cut themselves out years ago. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, I contacted my attorney, Eleanor Hayes, a civil litigation attorney who came highly recommended. She was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and the sharpest legal mind I'd ever encountered. "This is remarkable," she said after reviewing Richard's documentation. "I've never seen someone anticipate a will contest this thoroughly. Your father-in-law essentially built our entire defense case before he died." The legal battle began in earnest 2 weeks later when Kevin and Brittany filed their formal contest. They'd hired Sterling and Hayes, one of the most expensive estate litigation firms in the state. Their strategy became clear from the first filing. They would argue that Richard had been mentally incompetent due to medication and illness, that I had isolated him from his family and manipulated him during his vulnerable state, and that the drastic change in his will was evidence of undue influence. Their petition painted me as a calculating opportunist who had positioned herself as Richard's caregiver to gain access to his finances. They claimed I had monitored his communications with his children, limited their access to him during his final months, and exploited his grief over Ethan's death to convince him to change his will. Some of their allegations stung because they contained grains of truth twisted into sinister interpretations. Yes, I had been present for most of Richard's medical appointments because no one else would take him. Yes, I had helped manage his medications because he was struggling to keep track of complex dosing schedules. Yes, I had become his primary emotional support because his biological children had abdicated that role. The depositions began 3 months into the case. Kevin went first, accompanied by his expensive lawyers and wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He presented himself as a grieving son whose father had been manipulated by a scheming daughter-in-law. My father was a proud man, Kevin testified. He wouldn't have wanted to burden anyone with his illness, but she inserted herself into every aspect of his care, making herself indispensable. She isolated him from his family, convinced him we didn't care about him. Eleanor's cross-examination was devastating. She played recording after recording of Kevin's calls to Richard. Each one focused on money rather than care. When she asked him to name Richard's oncologist, Kevin couldn't answer. When she asked about Richard's medication schedule, Kevin claimed he'd never needed to know such details. Mr. Davies, Eleanor said, you've testified that the defendant isolated your father from his family. Can you tell me the last time you visited him without asking for money? Kevin's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. Kevin sat silent for nearly a full minute before admitting he couldn't remember. Can you tell me about your father's treatment plan, his prognosis, his daily struggles with the side effects of chemotherapy? Again, Kevin had no answers. Eleanor played the recording of him discussing tax planning, while Richard was transitioning to hospice care. By the end of the deposition, Kevin looked less like a grieving son and more like what he was, a man angry about losing money he'd counted on inheriting. Brittany's deposition was even more damaging to their case. She'd clearly been coached to present herself as a devoted daughter who'd been cruelly cut out of her father's life, but her performance fell apart under scrutiny. Mrs. Jenkins, Eleanor began, you've testified that you had a close relationship with your father. Can you tell me about the last meaningful conversation you had with him that wasn't related to money? Brittany's eyes darted to her lawyers, then back to Eleanor. We talked all the time. He was very interested in the children's activities, their school performance. I'm sure he was, Eleanor replied. But I'm asking about a conversation focused on him. His feelings, his fears, his needs. When did you last ask your father how he was coping emotionally with his diagnosis? The question hung in the air. Brittany's face flushed as she realized she couldn't answer. Eleanor played recordings of Brittany's calls, each one revealing her complete focus on her own needs rather than her father's welfare. The moment that sealed her fate came when Eleanor played the recording of Brittany dismissing Richard's cancer battle as dramatic attention-seeking. Mrs. Jenkins, do you recall telling your father that he was being dramatic about his cancer, comparing it to a flu he'd had years earlier? That's taken out of context. I was just trying to keep his spirits up, encouraging him not to be negative. Brittany's composure cracked completely. He was always a bit of a hypochondriac, she snapped. Even as children, we knew he exaggerated every little ache and pain. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing words that destroyed any sympathy Brittany might have garnered. Eleanor let the statement hang in the air before moving on. The medical testimony phase of the trial was crucial to disproving claims that Richard had been mentally incompetent. Dr. Emily Roberts, Richard's oncologist, testified that while cancer and chemotherapy can affect cognitive function, Richard had remained sharp and engaged throughout his treatment. Mr. Davies was remarkably informed about his condition, Dr. Roberts testified. He researched treatment options, asked detailed questions about side effects, and made complex decisions about his care right up until his final week. I never observed any cognitive impairment that would affect his ability to make legal or financial decisions. Dr. Roberts also testified about Richard's mental state during his illness. He was very aware of the support system around him, often mentioning how grateful he was for his daughter-in-law's help. He seemed sad about his children's limited involvement, but not confused about the reality of their relationships. The pharmacy records subpoenaed by Eleanor showed that while Richard was on pain medication, the dosages were moderate and carefully managed. There was no evidence of the kind of heavy sedation that might impair judgment. But the most powerful testimony came from Richard's home health nurse, Elena Martinez, a 20-year veteran of hospice care who had seen countless families navigate terminal illness. Mr. Davies was one of the most mentally alert patients I've worked with, Elena testified. Even in pain, he was tracking his medications, asking about his lab results, making jokes to lighten the mood. His daughter-in-law was usually there when I visited, and I could see how much he appreciated her presence. Elena's observations about family dynamics were particularly damaging to Kevin and Brittany's case. In my experience, you can tell a lot about family relationships by how people behave when someone is dying. Mr. Davies' son and daughter called occasionally, but it was always the daughter-in-law who knew his comfort preferences, his medication schedule, his appetite patterns. She knew him better than anyone. When asked about the allegation that I had isolated Richard from his family, Elena was emphatic. Absolutely not. She encouraged him to call his children, helped him write emails when typing became difficult. I heard her several times suggesting he invite them to visit. The isolation came from their end, not hers. Eleanor also called character witnesses who had observed Richard and me together during his illness. His neighbor, Mrs. Albright, testified about seeing me arrive every morning to help with breakfast and medications. The volunteer coordinator from his church spoke about how I had accompanied Richard to services, even when he was too weak to participate fully, just so he could maintain connection with his faith community. But perhaps the most compelling witness was Richard's longtime attorney, Robert Jenkins, who had prepared both the original will and the revision. Robert testified that Richard had been completely clear about his intentions when changing the will. Mr. Davies came to me with very specific instructions, Robert testified. He wanted to leave his estate to his daughter-in-law because, in his words, she's the only one who's treated me like family instead of a bank account. He was lucid, adamant, and had clearly thought through the decision carefully. Robert also testified that Richard had anticipated the will contest and had specifically asked about steps to make his intentions legally bulletproof. He was concerned his biological children would challenge the will, not because they loved him, but because they expected his money. He wanted to make sure his true wishes would be honored. The trial phase began 6 months after the initial filing. Kevin and Brittany's legal team presented their case first, arguing that the will change was so dramatic and unexpected that it could only be explained by mental incompetence or undue influence. Their lead attorney, senior attorney Maxwell Reed, was skilled at painting sympathetic pictures. He spoke movingly about children losing their father and then being cut out of his will by someone outside the family. He argued that cancer and chemotherapy had clouded Richard's judgment, making him susceptible to manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Senior Attorney Reed said in his opening statement, "this case is about a vulnerable, dying man who was systematically isolated from his family and convinced to disinherit his own children. The defendant may have started with good intentions, but somewhere along the way, caregiving became something darker. A calculated campaign to position herself as the sole beneficiary of a substantial estate." But Senior Attorney Reed's case fell apart when confronted with Richard's meticulous documentation. Every allegation of manipulation was contradicted by recordings showing me encouraging Richard to maintain contact with his children. Every claim of isolation was disproven by evidence that I had facilitated visits and phone calls that Kevin and Brittany had been too busy to make. When Eleanor presented our defense, the evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of recordings showed the stark difference between how I treated Richard and how his biological children interacted with him. Financial records proved that I had consistently refused Richard's offers of money, while his children had treated him like a personal ATM. But the most powerful moment came when Eleanor played Richard's final recording, made just 1 week before his death. His voice was weak but determined. "I know my children will contest this will. They'll claim I wasn't in my right mind, that I was manipulated. But I want to be clear. I've never been more certain of any decision in my life. I'm leaving my estate to Ethan's widow because she's the only person who's loved me without wanting something in return. She's the only one who saw me as a person instead of a paycheck. That's what family should be." When Eleanor finished playing the recording, the courtroom was completely silent. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict in my favor. They upheld Richard's will completely and rejected all claims of undue influence or mental incompetence. But the legal victory was just the beginning of the aftermath. The judgment didn't just preserve my inheritance. It destroyed Kevin and Brittany's reputations in their suburban neighborhood. Richard had been well known and respected, and the details of the trial became local gossip. The recordings, now part of public court records, revealed the extent of their callousness toward their dying father. Their friends and colleagues learned how they had treated Richard's cancer diagnosis as an inconvenience and his generosity as an entitlement. Kevin's startup company, already struggling, collapsed completely when his business partners learned about the trial. Who wants to invest with someone who calculated tax strategies while his father was dying? His reputation in the technology community was permanently damaged. Brittany's social circle in her affluent community turned cold after details of the case became public. The other mothers at her children's private school whispered about how she had treated her dying father. Her marriage to David, already strained by financial pressure, began to crumble under the added shame. But the most devastating consequence for both of them was the loss of their children's respect. Chloe and Leo, now old enough to understand what had happened, learned that their mother had prioritized money over their grandfather's well-being. Kevin's teenage daughter, Olivia, stopped speaking to him entirely after listening to the recordings online. 6 months after the trial ended, I received a call from Chloe, now 16 and living primarily with her father following her parents' divorce. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how Mom treated Grandpa. I would have visited him if I'd known he was so sick." "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "You were a child. You trusted the adults in your life to make good decisions." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "What was he like at the end? Was he happy?" I thought carefully about how to answer. "He was at peace. He felt loved and cared for. He talked about you and Leo all the time, how proud he was of you both. He never stopped being your grandfather, even when he was disappointed in your parents." Chloe started crying. "I miss him so much. I keep thinking about all the visits we didn't make, all the phone calls we didn't return because Mom said he was fine." This was the real tragedy of Kevin and Brittany's choices, not just what they'd done to Richard, but what they'd stolen from their own children. Chloe and Leo had lost years of relationship with their grandfather because their parents had prioritized money over connection. I established a college fund for both of Richard's grandchildren from the inheritance, something I knew he would have wanted. When I told Chloe about it, she cried harder. "Why are you being nice to us after everything our parents did?" "Because you're not responsible for their choices," I said. "And because your grandfather loved you completely, even when he was hurt by their behavior. This is what he would have wanted." Leo, now 14, eventually reached out too. He was angry at his parents in the way only a teenager can be, completely black and white, unforgiving of their hypocrisy. He moved in with his father after the divorce and refused to speak to Brittany at all. "She lied to us," he told me during one of our phone calls. "She told us Grandpa was fine, that he didn't need visitors because he was resting, but he was dying and alone." "He wasn't alone," I corrected gently. "And he understood that you didn't know the truth about his condition. He never blamed you for your parents' decisions." These conversations with Richard's grandchildren helped heal something in me that the legal victory hadn't touched. The trial had vindicated Richard's decision and exposed his children's behavior, but it hadn't brought him back. Connecting with Chloe and Leo felt like honoring his memory in a way that went beyond money or legal documents. 3 years later, I still live in Richard's house, surrounded by reminders of both him and Ethan. I've turned Richard's study into a reading room, keeping his books but adding my own. His recliner sits by the window where he used to watch birds in the garden. I've used part of the inheritance to start a foundation that provides support for family caregivers, people like me who find themselves caring for loved ones through serious illness. The foundation offers respite care, support groups, and emergency financial assistance for medical expenses. Kevin eventually moved across the country, claiming he needed a fresh start. His ex-wife told me he's working for a technology company in Colorado, living in a studio apartment, and rebuilding his life slowly. He's never contacted me or apologized for his behavior during Richard's illness. Brittany's life fell apart more dramatically. The divorce left her with minimal assets, and she struggled to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She works as a real estate agent now, barely making ends meet in a small apartment. Her relationship with her children remains fractured. Last year, on the anniversary of Richard's death, Brittany called me. It was the first time we'd spoken since the trial. "I've been thinking about Dad," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "About the things I said during his illness. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell someone who knew him that I'm sorry." I listened as she talked about her regrets, her attempts to rebuild relationships with her children, her recognition of how badly she'd handled her father's death. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not the money, the relationship. I can't remember the last time Dad and I had a real conversation. One where I actually listened to him instead of thinking about what I needed." I surprised myself by feeling sympathy for her. "He never stopped loving you," I told her. "He was hurt and disappointed, but he never stopped being your father." "Do you think?" She paused, struggling with the words. "Do you think he would have forgiven me eventually if he'd lived longer?" "I think he already had," I said, and realized I meant it. He understood that people make mistakes, that family relationships are complicated. He just wanted to be seen as more than a source of money. We talked for another hour, the longest conversation Brittany and I had ever had. She asked about Richard's final days, the things he'd said, whether he'd been in pain. I told her about his peaceful moments, his jokes with the nurses, his pride in his grandchildren. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not because Brittany's apology changed what had happened, but because it confirmed that Richard's decision had been about more than money. It had been about teaching his children the difference between transactional relationships and genuine love. 5 years after Richard's death, I've learned to see the inheritance not as money I won or deserved, but as a final gift from a man who had learned to value authentic connection over biological obligation. He'd given me financial security, yes, but more importantly, he'd given me an understanding of what real family looks like. The inheritance allowed me to honor both Richard's memory and Ethan's legacy. I've established scholarship funds in both their names, supporting students who show promise in engineering, Ethan's field, and caregiving, the role I'd stumbled into but learned to embrace. Sometimes I sit in Richard's garden, where I've planted roses in memory of both him and Ethan, and I think about the strange journey that brought us together. I married Ethan, never imagining I'd outlive him, never thinking I'd become a widow at 29 or a caregiver to his father. But those unexpected roles taught me something valuable about love. It's not about blood or obligation or expectation. It's about showing up, paying attention, and choosing each day to see someone as worthy of care. Richard didn't leave me his estate because I manipulated him. He left it to me because I loved him without keeping score, because I saw his dignity when others saw only opportunity, because I understood that family is something you create through action, not something you inherit through DNA. The money has been life-changing, but the real inheritance was the lesson Richard taught me about the difference between taking care of someone and truly caring for them. That's a gift worth more than any bank account. And it's one that Kevin and Brittany can still claim if they ever learn to see people as more than transactions. In the end, Richard got what he wanted most. The knowledge that he'd been loved completely and authentically, without agenda or expectation. And I got something I'd never expected.